Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
When someone dies, you expect a little kindness. A hug, a story, maybe a memory that makes your throat tighten. What you don't expect is a man like my Uncle Rick leaning against the kitchen counter with a lukewarm beer in one hand and a smug smile twisted across his face like he just won a bet no one else knew about. "This is it," he said, nodding at the taped-up cardboard box beside the back door. "She left you her crap. Said you were always her practice grandkid." I laughed, because that's what you do when someone says something so absurd it doesn't register right away. Practice grandkid? What the hell did that even mean? But Rick didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. Just turned and walked out, his keys jangling in his pocket like it was some kind of victory bell. I stood there in the house that still smelled like her, like cinnamon and cedar and lemon oil, and stared at the box. The kitchen light was buzzing, the kind of flicker that makes your vision dance, and I suddenly felt like I was dreaming. Or maybe falling. I bent down, cracked the tape, and opened it like I was defusing a bomb. And in a way, I guess I was. The first thing I saw was my old stuffed bunny, the one with one ear half torn from when I dragged it everywhere as a toddler. Then came the faded wooden blocks we used to build castles with, and a tin lunchbox I'd forgotten existed. Beneath all that, wrapped in yellowed newspaper and tied with fraying string, was the dollhouse. It was smaller than I remembered, of course. That's what happens when you grow up, everything shrinks. But it still had the chipped pink shutters, the tiny white rocking chair on the front porch, and that silly little chimney that always leaned to the left. My grandmother used to say the house had magic in it, that it kept secrets like a diary and listened like a priest. I used to laugh at that. But standing there, surrounded by the echo of her absence, it didn't feel so silly anymore. I lifted the dollhouse out carefully and placed it on the counter. My fingers brushed over the painted shingles, now dusty and dull. The little front door creaked when I pushed it open, and I caught a whiff of something floral, like the perfume she used to dab behind her ears. That was the moment something shifted. I didn't know what, not yet, but something inside me said, "Look deeper." I turned the dollhouse around and removed the back panel. Inside, everything was exactly how I'd left it as a kid. The miniature couch with the cigarette burn from when she tried to teach me how to light birthday candles with a match. The doll in the corner with one shoe missing and her hair cut at an angle because I wanted her to look cool. The dining room table with the mismatched chairs we used to pretend hosted dinner parties for animals that couldn't sit upright. And then I saw it. The attic. The roof of the dollhouse was hinged, a feature my grandfather had built before he died, long before I was born. I lifted it slowly, carefully, half expecting cobwebs to fall out. But instead, there it was. Tucked neatly into the corner beneath the tiny wooden beams was an envelope, yellowed with age and tied with a red ribbon that looked just like the ones she used on Christmas gifts. My name was written on the front. Not just Sarah, but in her full handwriting. To my Sarah, the one who never stopped paying attention. My heart punched me in the chest. I didn't open it right away. I just stood there, gripping the edges of the dollhouse, while the kitchen seemed to spin around me. All I could hear was the distant hum of the fridge and the wind tapping against the window over the sink. This was no sentimental box. This wasn't just old toys and leftovers from a dead woman's attic. This was something else. Something intentional. She'd left this for me. And Rick had no idea. That bastard probably never even opened the box. I sat down at the kitchen table, the chair creaking beneath me, and untied the ribbon with shaking fingers. The paper was fragile, folded neatly 3 times. Inside, her handwriting danced across the page, and it began with words that sliced clean through my anger and confusion. "You were always the one." Just 5 words, and the ground under my feet shifted. Everything that had seemed final, her death, the will, Rick's smug little grin, now felt premature. I wasn't holding a goodbye in my hands. I was holding the beginning of something. A secret. A plan. Maybe even a revenge she didn't get to finish herself. And if Grandma Betty started something, well, hell, I was going to finish it, even if it meant going head-to-head with the man who thought he'd already won. The paper felt like skin, soft and worn, almost as if it could crumble if I breathed too hard, and for a moment I just stared at it, afraid to unfold it, because whatever was inside might change something I wasn't ready to have changed. But I knew I had to read it, even if it undid everything I thought I knew about my family, my grandmother, and the dusty little world I'd stepped into by opening that dollhouse attic. I peeled back the folds with fingers that wouldn't quite stay steady, and as I read the first few lines, I felt something old and painful and familiar uncoil inside me like it had just been waiting for this moment to spring back to life. "My sweet Sarah," it began, in that spidery script of hers that always made her grocery lists look like love notes. "If you are reading this, it means the dollhouse did its job. And more importantly, it means Rick didn't get to you first." I sat back, stunned for a second, the letter trembling slightly in my hands, and then I read on, because once I started, there was no stopping. She didn't waste words with pleasantries. She went straight into it. "I never trusted Rick," she wrote, "and I think deep down, neither did you. He's clever in that manipulative kind of way. Always has been. He talks like he's doing you a favor while stealing the bread from your table." I could almost hear her voice in my head, dry and sharp and just a little playful, like she was sitting across from me with a cup of tea and a knowing smirk. "I made a second will," she said. "One that reflects what I actually want, not what I was pressured into by your uncle and his polished lawyer friends. But I didn't file it the traditional way. I couldn't risk him finding it. So I left it in pieces, hidden in the only place I knew you'd go looking." And then she wrote the line that pulled the breath straight out of my lungs. "Think like you're turning 10 again." The words hit me like a wave from the past. All those childhood birthdays came rushing back, those mornings when I'd wake up to find a note under my pillow, and Grandma would say something like, "The real gift isn't wrapped, it's hidden." And we'd spend the whole day solving clues that led to treasures buried in the garden or taped to the inside of the cookie jar lid. I hadn't thought about those scavenger hunts in years, but now it was like they'd been rehearsals for this exact moment. And maybe they were. I set the letter down gently and turned my eyes back to the dollhouse. It wasn't just a toy anymore. It was a map, a vault, a damn time capsule. I leaned in, studying every inch with new eyes. There was something off about the nursery floor. One of the boards didn't sit flush with the others. I dug a nail underneath and felt it lift, revealing a narrow cavity just wide enough to fit a playing card. I pulled it out carefully. It was an old Monopoly chance card, the kind we used to use as bookmarks when she read to me at night. But this one had something scrawled on the back in pencil: B4L7, green key. I had no idea what that meant, but my stomach flipped all the same. And then I remembered something else, something from the last birthday hunt I ever had, right before I turned 11 and decided I was too old for games. She'd made me a treasure map out of cereal box tops, cut them into weird shapes, pasted them together, then drew little X's with riddles written in rhymes. I didn't know it then, but she was teaching me something. Teaching me to notice. To look beyond the obvious. She always gave me puzzles with 5 clues. 5 clues meant one final prize. Except this time, she said 6, which made no sense. 5 times 6 is 25, right? I stopped and furrowed my brow, because that didn't sound right even as I said it out loud. Something about the numbers felt off, but I brushed past it, too focused to care. I'd figure it out later, or maybe someone else would. I returned to the box of toys and lifted each piece with care now, like they were part of some ancient ritual. There was the tin lunchbox again, the one we used to pretend was a suitcase when we played Train Station. Nothing inside. I checked the base, smooth. Then I pulled out the porcelain tea set wrapped in crumpled paper towels. Most of it was chipped or stained, but the little teacup with the pink rose on the side was still intact. And for some reason, it felt heavier than it should have. I turned it over in my hand and saw the faintest scratch along the base. Not a crack. Not wear and tear. A line. An etched line, like someone had taken a needle and drawn something into the porcelain. I squinted at it under the light and saw what looked like a map. It was tiny, but clear, a sketch of her backyard garden with a large X behind the hydrangea bush near the fence. My chest tightened. That bush had been there for as long as I could remember. She used to prune it every week like it was a temple. Once I asked her why, and she said, because some things are sacred, and even sacred things need tending. I grabbed my coat without thinking, my heart hammering in a way it hadn't in years, not with fear, but with anticipation, with hope, with a sudden and wild sense that I was about to uncover something more than just legal papers or family drama. I was chasing a ghost, yes, but it was a ghost who'd planned this path for me, who believed I could walk it. Outside, the wind was picking up, and the garden loomed ahead like it was daring me to dig. And so, shovel in hand, I crossed the yard toward the hydrangeas, not knowing exactly what I'd find buried beneath the roots, but damn sure it wasn't going to be nothing. The hydrangeas looked different at night, like strangers dressed in shadows and moonlight, their delicate blossoms curled into fists beneath the weight of the damp air, and for a long moment I stood at the edge of the garden just watching them, remembering the way my grandmother used to hum as she trimmed them, how she moved through the backyard, like it was a cathedral, and every leaf needed its own prayer. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of soil and something else I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was memory, maybe it was dread, but either way, I knew I couldn't just stand there staring forever. So I gripped the shovel tighter and stepped off the flagstone path into the overgrowth. The ground was soft from recent rain, but the roots of the hydrangea bush ran deep, thick veins of tangled life that refused to give way easily, and I had to fight for every inch as I dug down. With each thrust of the shovel, my breath grew louder in my ears, like the pounding of war drums before a siege, and I kept glancing over my shoulder like Rick might come stomping out of the shadows and demand to know what the hell I thought I was doing. But the night was silent except for the occasional creak of old trees and the slow rhythm of metal on earth. After what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 20 minutes, I hit something hard. Not a rock, not a root, but something hollow and man-made, something that thudded when I tapped it and didn't belong under a flower bed. I dropped to my knees and clawed at the dirt until I uncovered the edges of a rusted metal box, small and square, the kind of thing you might use to store old photos or love letters if you were the sentimental type. My grandmother had always been sentimental in her own quiet way, but this wasn't nostalgia. This was strategy. This was war. I hauled the box out of the earth, brushed it off with my sleeve, and fumbled with the clasp until it gave with a sharp pop. Inside, wrapped in a layer of plastic to protect it from the elements, was a flash drive. That's it. No letter, no explanation, just a cheap black USB stick resting in the middle of a metal coffin like it was the only thing that mattered. And maybe it was. I didn't wait. I didn't even bother cleaning up the mess I'd made in the garden. I ran back to the house with the flash drive gripped in my palm like it might vanish if I loosened my fingers. My hands were shaking as I plugged it into my laptop, my pulse so loud I could barely hear the hum of the hard drive spinning to life. One folder. One document. A PDF labeled Final Will and Testament of Elizabeth May Miller. My grandmother's real will. I opened the file and felt the air go out of my lungs in one long, quiet collapse. There it was, plain and official and notarized, her signature curling at the bottom like the tail of a snake. In this version, she left everything to me. The house. The savings account I didn't even know existed. The land Rick had been trying to sell off like he already had the deed in his pocket. Every last piece of it was mine. And then I saw the final line, a note typed beneath the signature, written in that same careful tone she always used when she was about to say something important. It said, "If you found this via the Dollhouse, contact Mr. Raymond E. Clark, ESQ immediately. He will know what to do." I stared at the name for a moment, the gravity of what I was holding finally settling onto my shoulders. This wasn't just about a greedy uncle or a dead woman's wishes. This was a trap my grandmother had laid long ago, a trap only I could spring, because only I had known where to look. And Rick, for all his smugness and self-importance, had no idea it even existed. I picked up my phone and dialed the number listed in the document. It rang 3 times before a voice answered, low and professional, with the kind of practiced calm that only comes from decades of dealing with other people's messes. "Raymond Clark," he said, and I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "My name is Sarah Miller," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "and I found something in my grandmother's dollhouse." "Something," she said, "only you would understand." There was a long pause, the kind that feels like a held breath, and then he said, "You found the drive, then?" "Yes," I said. "I have the will." Another pause, but this time it was sharper, edged with something like urgency. "Listen carefully," he said. "This changes everything. But we need to move fast. Rick just filed to sell the land tomorrow." And just like that, the world tilted. I stood there with the phone pressed to my ear, staring at the glow of the screen where my grandmother's will still flickered, and realized that everything Rick thought was his was about to slip through his fingers like water. She'd outplayed him. She'd trusted me to finish what she couldn't. And now I had less than 24 hours to make sure her last move landed like a punch to the gut. I didn't feel scared. I felt ready. Ready in a way I hadn't felt in years. Because the rules had changed, and I wasn't just the quiet niece anymore. I wasn't the practiced grandkid. I was the real heir. And Rick was about to find that out the hard way. The morning I called Rick and asked if he wanted to grab lunch, I half expected him to smell the trap before I even finished my sentence, but apparently years of believing himself the smartest person in every room had dulled his instincts beyond repair. He said yes almost too quickly, like he couldn't wait to gloat a second time, certain I'd finally accepted my fate as the family footnote, the practice grandkid who got a box of junk and not a damn thing more. I picked a small diner just off the highway where nobody would know us, where the booths were always sticky and the waitresses always looked half a smoke break away from quitting. I wanted him off his game, and that place had a way of making everyone feel just a little unimportant. He showed up in a pressed shirt that screamed midlife crisis lawyer on casual Friday, and he didn't even bother hiding his smirk when he slid into the booth across from me. "You look good," he said, and it wasn't a compliment, it was a weapon. I smiled like it didn't cut. "Thanks, Rick," I said, sipping my coffee. "I've been doing a lot of thinking. About Grandma. About you. About what all this means." He leaned in, elbows on the table, that snake oil salesman shine already spreading across his face. "I'm glad you reached out," he said. "Closure is important. We all grieve in different ways." I nodded slowly, pretending to digest that nonsense like it was real food and not the same patronizing ball he'd been feeding me since I was old enough to read books he thought were beneath him. "You were right, I said, stirring cream into my coffee. About the inheritance. About me being the practiced grandkid. I mean, it's not like I was ever the favorite." He laughed, loud and sharp, and waved a hand at the waitress like he owned the building. "You always were a little slow on the uptake," he said. "But hey, at least now you can let it go, right?" I let the silence hang for just a second longer than comfort would allow, then said, as casually as I could, "Well, I've been talking to a few people. About selling my half of the land. Just to get some closure, He blinked. Once. Twice. Then the smirk twitched, like a crack running across a frozen lake. "Your half?" he said, his voice tightening, the air around us shifting in that small, subtle way that only happens when someone starts realizing they've lost control of the room. "Yeah," I said, pulling a folded document from my purse. "I figured we should talk about it before it gets messy." He took the paper like it might bite him and unfolded it with shaking hands, scanning the first few lines like he couldn't believe his eyes. And maybe he couldn't. Because there it was in black and white, Grandma's second will, legally notarized, properly witnessed, filed, and ready to be dragged into court if he so much as sneezed wrong in my direction. His face paled in slow motion, the blood draining out of his smug little kingdom as the truth settled into the cracks of his carefully constructed reality. "Where the hell did you get this?" he asked, his voice flat now, his appetite gone. "Oh, it's been in the family," I said, smiling. Right where she knew I'd find it. He tried to play it cool, but I could see the gears grinding behind his eyes, could almost hear them screaming as he scrambled for a way out. "We can work something out," he said, suddenly all velvet and reason. "You don't need to make this a fight. We're family." I stood up slowly, letting him sit there with the weight of it all pressing down on him like a goddamn avalanche. "You're right," I said. "We're family. Which is why I'm not pressing charges for now." His mouth opened, but nothing came out. I left him there, still holding the will like it was a dead rat he didn't know what to do with, and walked out into the parking lot with my heart pounding in a rhythm that felt suspiciously like freedom. By the time I got back to the house, my house now, not his Raymond Clark, had already filed the will in probate court. Rick had officially lost everything he thought was his birthright, and all he could do was watch from the sidelines as the system he thought he owned handed the game to someone who'd been written off before it even started. Later that afternoon, I walked through Grandma's house room by room, reclaiming each corner like it was enemy territory now liberated. I dusted off the photo albums, ran my fingers over the armrest of her favorite chair, and finally sat in it, something I'd never dared to do when she was alive. Rick always called it the throne, as if even then he was laying claim to something he didn't earn. Well, now it was mine. And that's when the memory hit me. I was maybe 9 or 10, curled up in the corner of the room with a library book, when Rick walked in and scoffed loud enough to pull me out of the story. "Still wasting your time on fairy tales?" he'd said. "You'll never get anywhere living in Fantasyland." But here I was, sitting in the throne, holding the title to the house, while he fumbled in the dark without a clue that Grandma had played him like a violin. Turns out fairy tales do teach you something, like how to outsmart the dragon when nobody else believes in you. That night, as I stepped outside to get something from my car, I noticed the shattered glass on the ground before I even saw the back window had been busted in. My stomach dropped as I rushed forward, already knowing it wasn't random. Taped under the wiper blade was a piece of lined notebook paper, scrawled in block letters, with a hand I'd bet my life belonged to Rick. "You don't deserve any of it. You manipulated her." I stared at the note for a long time, the words trembling in the breeze, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel anger. I felt something colder. Something sharper. Because Rick hadn't lost yet. But neither had I. And this game wasn't over. Not even close. The night Rick shattered my car window, I barely slept. I lay awake with the note clenched in one hand and a growing knot of doubt crawling its way into my chest like a slow leak of poison. There was something about his words that scratched at a raw part of me I hadn't realized was still bleeding. "You manipulated her." I kept replaying it in my head, not because I believed him, but because part of me needed to know if I could. Could I have done that? Could I have twisted my grandmother's trust into something self-serving and ugly without even realizing it? Was I so desperate to believe I mattered to her that I overlooked what Rick saw as the truth? For the first time since I found the will, I let myself consider the worst-case scenario, that I had read too much into her clues, that the letter in the dollhouse wasn't a master plan, but just an old woman's sentimental goodbye. That maybe I had projected meaning onto something that wasn't there because I needed it to be there. Maybe Rick wasn't lying, at least not entirely. Maybe he really thought he'd earned it all. Maybe my grandmother had told him one thing and me another, and left us both scrambling through the aftermath like scavengers. I spent the morning pacing through the house like a ghost, touching objects like they could answer questions I didn't know how to ask. The silence was heavier than usual, thick and watchful, like the walls themselves were waiting for me to either fall apart or snap out of it. I almost didn't go back to the dollhouse. Part of me didn't want to see it again, not if it meant facing the possibility that I'd gotten everything wrong. But I did. And I'm glad I did. It was pure instinct that made me lift the tiny piano from the living room floor of the dollhouse. I'd glanced at it a dozen times before, never thinking it held anything other than dust and splinters, but today something pulled me toward it, a nudge in the gut, maybe, or just desperation disguised as curiosity. I picked it up and shook it gently. Nothing. Then I flipped it over and saw the smallest seam, almost invisible, running along the bottom edge. I wedged a letter opener into it and popped the panel loose. Inside was one last envelope, aged like the others, but sealed with a wax stamp that made my throat tighten. It was her seal, an old rose she used on birthday cards when I was a kid, the same one she used to press into jam jar labels with melted candle wax. It had always been her secret signature, a way of saying this is real, this is from me. I opened the envelope with shaking hands and unfolded the letter, already knowing it would be her voice, already knowing it would be the answer to the question I didn't want to admit I'd been asking. If Rick's angry, it began, that means you did it right. I sank into the nearest chair and read it again, this time aloud, needing to hear her words out loud to believe them. I knew he'd push back. Of course he would. He's always thought the world owed him something just for showing up. But you've always earned your place. You've always looked deeper even when no one was watching. The letter went on to explain everything I had suspected and more. She had changed her will after Rick's last visit, after he tried to get her to sign over power of attorney with what she described as a smile full of sharp teeth. She'd known he would manipulate, pressure, twist the truth, and she knew the moment she died, he would make his move. So she made hers. The scavenger hunt wasn't just nostalgia, it was a failsafe. She wrote, I didn't leave this for a lawyer to find. I left it for the only person I trusted to finish what I started. Tears stung my eyes, but I didn't cry. I felt steady, solid, forged in fire. The last line of the letter sealed it all. Tell the truth if you want to. Or don't. You've already won. Later that week, I finalized the paperwork to sell the land. Yes, the very one Rick had tried to claim before he realized the rug had been yanked from under him. The buyers were a local nonprofit that builds community spaces, and I donated a large portion of the money to renovate the local library, renaming a wing after Grandma Betty. I made sure her name would outlast all the bullshit, that she'd be remembered not for what Rick tried to steal, but for what she gave, quietly, cleverly, completely. Rick tried to sue, of course. He always was a sore loser. But the court threw it out faster than I expected. The will was airtight, the documentation flawless, and the judge didn't even look twice when I handed over the letter from Raymond Clark, confirming everything from legal authentication to the chain of custody on the flash drive. Rick stood there in court with that same expression I remembered from childhood, the one he used when I beat him at Scrabble, even though he insisted I wasn't old enough to play properly. He never looked at me again after that. I kept the house. I kept the dollhouse. I kept the memories. And I finally let go of the doubt. One evening, weeks later, after the dust had settled and the phone had finally stopped ringing, I walked into the study with a cup of tea and sat across from the dollhouse again. It had grown quiet, as if it knew its purpose had been fulfilled. Still, I opened the attic, half out of habit, half out of hope, expecting to find the same secret corner where it all began. But it was empty now. No notes. No letters. No tricks. Just silence and dust and space where something once lived. And I smiled. Funny thing about dollhouses, people think the attic is just for storing old junk. But in ours, the attic was always where the treasure lived.